We are here in conversation with Noëmi Lakmaier and Nikki from ArtsAdmin to discuss Noëmi's performance piece, The Observer Effect.
Noëmi, I've met you sort of several times, well, lots of times over the last few years, and you've had a bursary through ArtsAdmin, and as part of that bursary, you made another piece. And I just wanted to take everyone, just for a moment, to a different part of London and just to sort of revisit that piece. It involved Noëmi crawling from Toynbee Studios, which is near Aldgate. It's near Whitechapel Gallery, and you crawled to the city. And the idea was that you would try to get to the Gherkin, to the sort of landmark building in the city. And this process lasted about 7 hours.
7.5.
7.5. Okay. And a few of us accompanied you on that, and it was a very fascinating day, seeing people's reactions and seeing you kind of disrupt the normal everyday life of the city, and being intensely observed, and a lot of people questioning why you were doing it and what it was for.
Yeah.
And I wondered if we could just go to that for a moment, because I think there's something about observation in your practice which relates to this piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of One Morning in May was very much rooted in this idea that I've been a resident of Tower Hamlets for a while, and I've walked this walk, or wheeled this walk in 10 minutes quite a few times, sort of breaching the boundary between Tower Hamlets, which is officially, or at least was at the time, the 5th most deprived area in the European Union. While the city, I don't know the statistics, but I'd imagine it's one of the most undeprived areas in the European Union. So I was very interested in this very close proximity between two entirely different socio-geographic areas, and the fact that you can so easily ignore this by just walking it in 10 minutes. It's a mile. So I guess when I came up with the idea of crawling it, I really wanted to find a way of doing it in a slow and arduous way to map the distance and the enormity of the difference between the two boroughs. But I think in the process of actually developing the piece and mainly doing it, I became very aware of that when I'm performing, when I'm doing a live piece that involves my body, disability is always a part of it, and I think a lot of the questions related to disability, didn't they? I mean, you probably are more aware of what the questions were asked.
Yeah. Quite a lot of the assumption was that it was a comment about disability, and that it was a comment about access and trying to move from one part of the city to another, which I found quite interesting, because actually you were pointing up something about social difference. Quite a number of people asked us why we were making you do it, which put us in quite a strange position, as if we were making a film. And it so happened that it was being documented.
Actually, interestingly, we had this question today. If I think Sarah was asked by somebody, if I recall correctly, while I was painting, somebody was asking you why I'm being made to do this.
Yes.
Which sort of brings up, I don't want to ask you why you do it, because I think it's unfair to ask artists exactly why they do things, but something about the value of it. And something about labour, because as you said, it's very arduous to crawl for 7 hours. It's also very arduous to receive huge mountains of donated shoes and to paint them blue and then to store them in boxes. In fact, there were some lovely comments from people who saw you, and one of them says, "Well done so far, good luck with the rest." It was, it's kind of,
yeah, I think I'll pin that up on my wall. There's so much more to do.
Yeah, there is a sense of duration being key to a lot of your work.
Oh, definitely. And I think I'm really interested in the idea of doing things that are essentially pointless. Either that they're completely pointless, like in essence, painting shoes blue is a pointless activity. And in essence, crawling from Tower Hamlets to the city is pointless, because I could take a bus or walk. So I'm very interested in finding, I guess, for myself, making sense out of completely absurd and pointless activities. And I guess doing them for the sake of doing them, in a sense, and hoping waiting for a point to grow out of it. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I mean, I think sometimes my work makes sense to me more than to my audiences, unfortunately. But
you've mentioned before that there's something about becoming an object, so that the more you do something as a sort of labour of work or perhaps a labour of love, that it doesn't matter whether it has a point or not. It doesn't matter if it's futile or if it's functional, but just the act of doing in itself has a value.
Yes,
and
it does.
I'm kind of curious about what space you go into. So is it a kind of meditation, or is it that you're sort of becoming an object or a machine? Or
I think it's always an attempt at becoming an object. I think that's been the process of my work in trying to turn a physical human body into an objectified object being. I'm also very interested in the kind of contradictions in that as a human being, and as long as you're human, and as long as you have a body, it is impossible to entirely become object. And I'm very aware of that while I'm trying to get as close to that as possible. And I suppose in the observer effect, in becoming a machine, a factory, whose entire purpose it is to paint shoes blue, which, as I said, is essentially absurd. But over the last week, and especially today when the doors were open, I was incredibly aware how difficult that can be, of being essentially cognitively aware that people are watching me as a piece of art and that they want to engage with me, but that in order to stay as much as possible in my objecthood, I have to ignore those interactions. And it felt incredibly wrong at times today. I was just saying to Nikki earlier on, there were two sort of around 9-year-old girls who seemed fascinated by the piece, and they just wanted to talk to me so much, and I think I left them leaving very disappointed. And I was really in a struggle in my head, if I break the objecthood to have a conversation with these kids, or if I talk to them might take away a long-lasting interest in art, or if I don't talk to him might leave with a disappointment in art.
They seem to have been fascinated. I was talking to Jonathan, the curator of the gallery, and he said that it's been a really fascinating process. You have had the doors closed most of the week, and he said that there have been so many comments from passers-by, and that in particular children have responded in a way that suggests a particular understanding. And I wonder if that relates to sort of play. In fact, Jonathan brought it up, that maybe adults, we learn to want a reason for something, and if you can't see a reason, then you're not quite sure, you sort of wonder what's going on, and it sort of dislodges something, and that children respond by seeing it as an act of play, almost.
I think there's definitely a point in that. I mean, I don't think of my work as making it for children.
No.
But I think one thing that comes up for me a lot in my work is that what I make in an essentially visual and physical way is often a language that I don't have words for. That it's almost a language in and of itself that I don't have the exact translation for, and I sort of rely on people like Jonathan and yourself and other people I've worked with to translate it. So if somebody asks me, and so what is it about? In a concise sentence, I'm completely stuck, because if I knew what it was about exactly in a concise sentence, I probably wouldn't actually be making the work.
And maybe it's a way of finding.
And I think children have maybe a level of not being quite so cerebral about it and engaging on it on a more visual, interactive level.
You've mentioned before that there's a kind of fishbowl effect in the work, that being behind these glass doors, essentially people are invited to observe you. Most of the time they can't interact directly by speaking. And you've been surprised at how long people have actually stayed with the work. And you've also presented this piece in other places, and one of them was Grace Church Street, which was it's a kind of private office space, which Space has been using for various projects. And it was live streamed on the web, but you had very few actual physical visitors.
Yes.
And I just wondered if we could talk for a moment about the differences in how that feels, how it changes the actual work. by being in this kind of space or being somewhere like the private office?
I think this felt a lot more like it was intended, but at the same time it felt harder. I think being seen online and having my viewers literally as a number on a web streaming service, to know there's 1, there's 7. It was very easy because there was no temptation to engage. I could look at my screen and say, great, 7 people are watching me. While here there was almost a sense of guilt that people are very interested in what I'm doing, but I'm not giving them back. But in a sense that's what I'm interested in, that one-way interaction, and I guess putting a viewer in a position of complicity, of watching something that they're not getting anything interactive back from, and to put them in quite a powerful role of acting with it how they wish.
And after this, after being here, you'll be in Deptford, I think.
Yes.
Is that right? So in a shop, which will have and I think you'll be behind a shop window.
I will.
So you'll be very much in a street, in the context of a street and passers-by. And is that over the course of a week as well?
It's 2 long weekends.
It's 2 long weekends.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I look forward to that because it's a very different space. It's tiny. Like this is so big, and it allows the piece really room to breathe. And the space I'm going to in Deptford is about the size of the table that I'm working on. And it's pushed right up against the window on Deptford High Street, where there's really an amazingly diverse community of everything, really. And I will be inches away from them, so I have no idea how it's going to turn out, but I'm really excited about that kind of really close interaction, and the probably banging on the window and trying to communicate in some way. I don't know, I'm just excited for it to see how that happens.
Yeah.
And I'm excited to see the piece change, because now that it's been taken out of its original space, I think I'm beginning to see the potential of the tour, of taking it to very different spaces. And in a way I'm beginning to see it less of a tour of the same piece rather than the development of a piece that becomes different everywhere it goes.
Yeah. And can we talk these boxes? So for anyone who hasn't actually been here, the shoes are painted blue and then stored on the shelves, and then they move into archive boxes, and then each pair is actually for sale, which is integral to the actual work, isn't it?
I mean, I think the piece, I think it's multi-layered, and that there are some very personal levels to me, which I think as I said, might not necessarily be understood by all the audiences, but I think something that was sort of overriding for me was this idea of the value of work and the value of labour in terms of producing something quite absurd, using something that was essentially still a useful object, a pair of shoes that we all wear, and most people, apart from the very, very poorest in the world, wear. And very deliberately, in this absurd way, turning it into something useless. Because as soon as they're painted blue, they can't really be worn anymore. It would destroy them completely. And I was interested in this chain of production and producing a commodity that is then becoming an art edition, that somehow through that absurd labour, through that, or if you want to put it in a different way, I guess the touch of the artist in inverted commas, become maybe something more valuable than it was when it was originally valuable as footwear. So it's integral to the idea of the piece that they're being sold as artist editions. So we have 500 editions which sell for £100 each. A blue pair of shoes in one of these boxes, numbered and labelled and signed.
And the value, this sort of value of labour, is that something that's coming up in lots of your work? I mean, do you feel that that's...
I think it's quite a new idea, the value of labour. I think it's sort of... Yeah, it went round my head before I started this, so I guess it's not that new, because this has been going around my head for about 2 years. But I really wanted to, because I think that the idea of changing everyday objects that were at some point consumed as commodities into something else has been going in my work for a while. but I've never really thought in terms of it of something that has been produced by a factory, changing it again in a factorial process into something else. So I guess it's quite new in that sense. And also adding, I'm normally not very precious. Well, I'm precious about the work, but not in the sense of sales. And I've always really felt that I don't want to sell my work for the sake of selling it. That's probably why I'm so poor. But in this piece, it felt very much that it's conceptually part of the work, that it becomes an item that is on offer for money.
It feels like most of the pieces that I'm familiar with of yours are very much about performance and the kind of performative moment, and also very sculptural as well. And it's very, it's noticeable. It has a very impressive sculptural quality, I think, particularly in the space, which really suits it, I think. Yeah.
But I think the sales of it, when they occur, I'm not sure if buyers are entirely aware of this, but they're an integral part of the performance.
Right. So the performance goes on, and then sort of it's sort of distributed in a wider sense.
Yes, and I guess the sculptural element of it then distributes around wherever the objects go. We now have a few, not just in the UK, but we have a few across Europe, and I kind of like that idea of small elements of the sculpture going to different geographic locations.
It'd be nice to sort of open it up, and if anybody has, I don't know, any comments or questions or things that you'd like to ask Noëmi.
Why blue?
Why blue?
She's somebody that asked it.
Yeah. Well, it's the piece is in a sense. I'm not sure if in homage to is quite correct, but 4 years ago. Or was it 5 years ago? I'm getting old. I had a residency at the Camden Arts Centre, which would entirely not have been possible without SHAPE. I was the inaugural recipient of the Adam Reynolds bursary, and that enabled me to have a residency at the Camden Arts Centre. And while I was at the Camden Arts Centre, I made this piece that was made from 500 pairs of shoes, painted exactly like these in yellow road marking paint. And at the time, the reason why it was yellow road marking paint was very much that it's a colour that we see every day without any real aesthetic value. It's a bureaucratic. It's got purely bureaucratic meaning. We don't look at a double yellow line and say pretty colour. So that was the idea at the time, and then when I started working on the observer effect with SHAPE, which was in part the intention to, with the sales, support SHAPE, which half of the profits will go to SHAPE directly to support future artists, was not to use the same colour again, so I didn't feel too much like it was just Experiment in Happiness, which the title was, again, in a different way. So we were talking about what other colour, because there's really 4 colours of road marking paint that would be recognisable, possibly 5 if you take green, but it's very rare. So I suppose it wasn't really important that it was blue, but we sort of felt that there was a slight element of a pun, that it's a disability arts charity, and that if we had to choose a colour other than yellow, blue would be quite appropriate for blue badge holders. I don't see that as an essential part of its colour. I think it's kind of almost become a sort of a blue.
But it seems that because blue, of course, has an art history.
It does, of course, yeah.
They go even further than that.
Yeah.
Expensive colour as well, very expensive dye to produce.
I think there's something interesting in that as well, that when we now look at blue on the road, and then in the UK it's mostly cycle lanes and disabled spaces, but in Europe, and I'm originally from Europe, in the entirety of the rest of Europe, it's restricted parking bays are marked in blue. So there's again an incredibly bureaucratic meaning that is not connected to the dye. And as you say, it's not so long ago it would have been an incredibly valuable colour, and now it's just spread on the roads as to tell you that you can't park there. So I think that's quite interesting about the blue. But I guess, to be very honest, to start with, it started with we don't want to do it yellow again. What's the most appropriate colour for this project?
Right. So what will be the next colour?
Ooh, that's if I'd be quite interested in white, but I'm not sure if there will be a next colour.
And I mean, the fact that they are all one colour, there's a kind of levelling that happens.
Absolutely.
I mean, they're very different styles of shoes, boots. They're in very different conditions.
Very different prices to start with. I think they've been levelled in that sense as well.
So, and is that something that's of interest to you generally? In this sort of
actually,
kind of
I've really been
levelling
thinking about it in the last few weeks. Of that, that hadn't occurred to me before. How levelling has been quite an important aspect. I don't know. Some of you might be aware that I've got this project which has been moving around, where I have Weeble sculptures, which Weebles wobble but they don't fall down, the little toys. I have 8 human-sized ones, which started in Dublin, and I invited originally 8 Dubliners to have a silver service dinner party while sitting in those Weebles that make it essentially impossible to eat anything delicately or at all. But then I guess the levelling didn't come out that much in that piece, because they were more or less the same type of people, arty types, that were interested in doing this. But I was then invited to do it in Belfast, and I was asked to do it, which naively I thought would be an easy task, and it really wasn't. But that made it amazing. Is to get politicians from all different sectarian fractions in one of the most iconic neutral places of Belfast, which is the Victoria Square shopping centre, to have a dinner party there. And we did manage to get politicians from every party who would never in a million years have sat down for dinner in any other way together. And somehow I was suddenly this kind of like, wow, you stick them into a Weeble in which they can't eat delicately, but they will sit around the same table. And if not it wasn't a terribly interesting conversation, because I think they were trying to be very guarded about what they said, but they sat at the same table, they shared the same meal, and they had a civilized conversation.
Wow. You need that at the UN or something, the UN.
So that felt amazing at the time. And then when I was painting these, and I was picking up a pair of shoes that would have originally cost £2,000, and then I picked up a pair from Tesco's, which would have probably been a £5, and I did exactly the same thing with them. I kind of felt that there's a similar process of you kind of do something with something. Sorry, that's a terrible phrase, do something with something, but that makes it the same. And it also makes it the same in the sense that they will all become the same edition. They will all sell for £100, whether it's your pair of George or your pair of Armani. So, and I think that's something interesting to think about for the future as well, and something that's not been so prominent in my thinking.
I like the idea that you sort of infuse it with your labour, and that therefore all of them are somehow of equal value.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something quite ironic about that as well, that kind of artist touch, which I very much say in inverted commas, that gives value or a levelling effect to the object.
Would anyone else like to ask a question or comment? Have you all seen the piece this week? At some point? Yeah. Maybe
Well, this was a fascinating piece, and you skirted around in your analysis about the political message that seems to be so obvious. And I just wondered, in what you're doing, that whilst you're trying not deliberately to communicate because you want to be an object, the message you're giving is one of complete polarisation between poverty-stricken people in working, slave labour wages, against, the means of production being held in the hands of very rich capitalists. And I just wondered, is that the message, or do you want that just to be interpreted by the observer?
I think I find it very difficult to distill any of my works down to one particular message. But you're right, that was definitely part of my thinking in this, and the idea of production being something that where there is a question of value in it, that, and especially with some of those shoes being sold so cheaply in the UK, and the idea of how much it would have cost in human value to make them somewhere in India, Bangladesh, Mexico, so it's definitely running through the thinking of this project, and I don't know, it's caused some contention whether to put it into the publicity or not, and it was a coincidence to start with, but and it never ended up in the publicity, that these boxes are made in a factory in China. And it came about because that company offered us the most beautiful boxes and financially the best deal, and I guess that's how you end up with a factory in China. And I have no idea how the workers in this factory were treated. But I think it's, to me personally, it's become an important part that I know these boxes have been made. I'm not sure if in a sweatshop, but in a factory with people paid infinitely less than anybody in the UK would be paid.
It feels like you often put yourself into a place of discomfort.
Yes.
I mean, conceptually, but also physically. You know, you're spending hours and hours. You know, it's been during all the opening hours of the library. So I think from 10 a.m. to.
But I allowed myself half an hour break. I was having loads of comfort.
And the crawling piece, as we talked about, was 7.5 hours long. You've done other pieces which have gone on for a long time and have just been physically extremely challenging.
Yeah.
And I'm sort of curious about that, about the discomfort that you create for yourself, but also perhaps for the viewer as well. Whether you're interested in the discomfort of the viewer.
I think there's two parts of that. I guess the more simple answer is to say, yes, I love stretching myself to how far I can go. And probably the observer effect wasn't the most stretching in terms of physical endurance. I'm sure the crawling was harder. And I sort of like not to look into it too much beforehand, because otherwise I might not do it. I had no idea how it would feel to crawl a mile. I had no idea how long it would take. No idea how terrible I'd feel for quite a while afterwards. But I think in terms of the viewer, that's really important to me, to make the viewer make the choice if they want to look at it and how they want to engage with it. I'm interested in the viewer's discomfort with it. And in a sense, the role that I give them to be complicit in an action by watching it, or even by not watching it. As I think with the crawling piece, people who paid no attention, people who stepped over me.
Yeah, there were quite a lot of people who actually didn't seem to notice you at all. Yeah. And then there were quite a lot of people who noticed but deliberately sort of walked past.
And there were two people who spat at me.
Yeah, and there were some quite violent reactions as well. So it's
lick the floor, bitch.
Yeah, it's kind of a severe. Yeah, I mean, I wonder. I mean, it's a very exposing.
Yeah, I'm interested
place to put yourself into. Yeah.
And I think it's part of the trial to be an object, because if you're an object, you don't mind being spat at. It doesn't matter.
So it's to go beyond the body and beyond a sort of human emotion to.
I suppose, or the idea of a human object. I mean, for just over a year, I explored becoming a human object by exploring the BDSM scene, the S&M and bondage scene, and very deliberately becoming somebody's slave for a year, and just to try out what it feels in a non-artistic sense to become used object. I don't know if I have an answer to that, how it feels, but it's informed my work a lot to take it out of an artistic context and take it into, I don't know if it was an everyday life context, but working with people who aren't artistic collaborators, but come from a very different angle at objectifying humans.
And I find that interesting because here, obviously, it's a library, a wonderful library, and it's a very cultural context, but it's not, and it is a gallery, but it's perhaps a more everyday context than quite a lot of galleries end up being. Deptford High Street is not going to be a gallery. Grace Street again was a private office block. And you seem very often to do work in places which aren't necessarily an obvious art context or a sort of just a gallery by themselves.
I don't know if that's so much part of the consideration. I think a space has to feel right. And if the space that feels right is a gallery, that's wonderful, like here. And if it's something that's something else, then that's also wonderful. And I think when I saw this space, when Lucy asked me initially if I'd be interested in doing it here, and I saw the space, I kind of knew that it would be absolutely perfect. It's almost like the Observer Effect is made for this space with the glass doors, and it's almost a perfect size. And I mean, what a strange coincidence that the shelves we've got fit precisely between the pillars. Yeah, I think I'd be open to gallery spaces for this in the future, or I don't know, anything that anybody comes up with.
And Lucy and Jonathan, as the curators of this, can I ask you a little bit about what your experience has been of the work, both of you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not based here, so I have been back and forth, but I've not been necessarily as much as I'd like to have been. But I think one of the reasons for me for asking Noëmi to bring the work here is because of the context of the library and because of the different people who come to the library who don't necessarily go to a gallery. And actually, we work in this gallery a lot, and we're often thinking about, the context of the library and how the work actually sits within that context. And for me, particularly, the children's library over there is a really big part of what we have to consider when we programme, because the kids do run across, and you can't ignore that. So you have to engage with the young children and families. And it's so interesting hearing you talk about the work being very one way, because for me the work screams like participation and access, and for me the work is one of the most wonderful things about the work that I realised straight away was that everybody would get it. Small children would get it, like people from any part of the community would get it. People who have been to art school or have been practising artists for years would understand it on a very conceptual level, and people who are just casually walking past would understand it on their own personal level, and that's what the richness of the work was, what really struck me very, very quickly, and how perfect that is for a space like the library where you have the kind of users coming in and out like this in quite a casual way. And I in my role kind of as an arts development officer, I want to let's have workshops, let's have children painting shoes, and that's where I go. And it's really interesting obviously to hear, and obviously that's not what you as an artist want to do with the work, and obviously that's completely fine. But and hearing you talk about those children going away disappointed was so interesting to hear you say that, and the tension between what you want the work to do, and in this context, the inevitable interaction with the work.
It felt really awful because I also wanted to allow them to go away with something special, which they obviously were very actively trying to get out of it, and they seemed very mature for their age, and it felt terrible to not give them that.
But I actually think what may happen in a situation like that is they go home and they talk to each other about it, and they talk to their parents about it, they talk to somebody else about it, and actually it becomes an ongoing conversation. So
maybe.
They might have that initial sense of like, oh, I didn't get the interaction that I was expecting or wanting, but actually, they can go away and they can understand that, and actually it might even make their experience that bit richer.
Maybe.
Because actually it's a bit more challenging, and even as a 9-year-old you can kind of understand satisfaction of kind of overcoming something intellectually in that small way.
I was quite surprised actually by the reactions of a lot of the children who came into the space. They seemed very respectful of her space and her work, and almost intuitively understood that she was doing something, and that they weren't necessarily to interact. They were interacting with the adults that they were with and asking questions. And there was this one small boy this morning who
he was incredible.
15 minutes. He just had question after question after question. He wasn't asking her, he was asking, it must have been his grandfather or something. But it's been really interesting actually to see the responses from the children.
I mean, for me, the work of yours, I know, has this kind of like urban fairy tale-ness to it. And there is this, and I think children get that straight away. They get that kind of impossible task that's being done over there in the corner, and they don't think, why would you do that? It's something that happens in the stories that they read all the time, and they get that straight away. And I think that's one of the reasons why, because for them it's like coming up close to a fairy tale.
That's That's an amazing analogy.
And they never get to do that. That's this stuff in books that they're reading just over there. So how lovely for that interaction to be possible for them.
Yeah.
I think that's a credit to the piece and how layered and
Absolutely.
the piece is.
Absolutely, yeah.
But it has been surprising for me how much it's captured children's imagination.
It surprised me
Really
too.
able to
Yeah.
engage with it. I think on a deep level than some of the adults actually will.
Yeah.
I think
One of the comments in the comments book actually talks about a guy who's written something about Jewish concentration camps
Yes.
and piles of shoes there. So that's a completely different way to
I
go.
find that extremely interesting because that's something that I was working with a lot, probably about 10 years ago, and moved away from because my father is Jewish and his parents died in a concentration camp. And while I was doing my MA, that was something that was very important to me, and the accumulation of objects and the human trace left in objects, especially in accumulated objects, and archiving them. That was incredibly important to me, and I hadn't realised that this piece was coming back to that. But somebody at Gracious Street pointed that out, and then I had that comment as well.
People have said that to me actually.
Quite a few people said that this week, actually.
Yeah, so it's interesting how an exhibition like this tells you stuff about the work that as the artist you don't know or you haven't understood. So it's sort of humbling to be here and see other people interact with it.
Sure, there's a kind of working through and
yeah, and I think that's
sort of
how new
sifting
work
to the
develops
surface
as well.
and-
Too.
yeah.
I mean, also an incredible experience. Unfortunately, I didn't get to speak to her because I was behind glass, and I'm not sure if any of you saw her. But there was I don't know how old, but to me she seemed very old, probably Indian lady in a sari, who read the blurb outside, looked at it for a while, and then sat cross-legged outside the space for about 3 hours and just watched me paint it. And that was amazing to think that somebody is that fascinated by the piece to spend. It was almost like she was meditating with the piece. And I'd have loved to have gone and talked to her, but again, like with the children, it's kind of the piece prohibits that.
And did you feel incredibly supported by that? I mean, did you feel?
I think in a strange way, I
direct
felt very
engagement?
supported, and in some way I felt slightly intimidated, which I suppose is not to my credit. But it was just incredibly interesting and very... I mean, I know I talk in a lot of my written work about how the audience is the catalyst to the work, and it really felt like that. It felt like she was making me do this, in a sense. This one elderly woman was the thing, the fuel that was keeping it going.
Yeah, you've talked about how the audience can impose a kind of discipline on the work, which must have been incredibly difficult to keep up at Gracechurch Street if you didn't have any live audience.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was very difficult to keep the concept up at all. It took a lot of discipline to not just go, I'll have a cigarette, I'll have a sandwich, because it would destroy the work. But there was nobody who would actually know that it would destroy the work, so what's the point? And I suppose in that way it was very interesting to work at Gracechurch Street as well.
I mean, to me it also speaks of how much work artists do, which is never actually seen. You know, it's never actually perceived, and it's just perhaps one of the very hardest sort of professions, because there's so much that goes into it which is never exposed or given a kind of validation. You know, and the artist has to keep going and keep going and keep going. And sort of what you're doing here is actually doing that in front of people. But very often an artist is doing it in their studio or in their bedroom or wherever, and just sort of keeping going, and that in itself is the art, I think, just to keep going.
I think it's hard to see that when you're the artist yourself, that that's what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of a constant turning up. You know. Yeah. Jonathan?
What's your relationship to the shoes once they're painted? Are they finished objects, or do you see them as finished when they go into a box and somebody purchases them?
I think
takes them
when they go into a box, they go back to being a commodity. I think they start off as a commodity and they finish as a commodity. In between, they're part of a performance, I guess.
There's quite a market transformation that takes place from the
Yes.
second-hand worn shoes into these almost fetishised objects that are on the shells. I mean, I invite anybody to come up and really have a look and scrutinise them because they're perfectly painted.
That's actually really important, that they are meticulously perfect. I guess it comes back again to the being a human or being a machine, because I try to emulate a machine as much as I can. I try to be as perfect as I can, and you can still, if you scrutinise them enough, you can still see that they're hand done. So I think that's quite important about them as well. That
they're almost perfect.
I think almost is the important word there.
Yeah. What happens if you do get a piece wrong that do you dispose of them, or do you, is there a way of, on a practical level when you're painting them?
To be honest, I haven't yet got one wrong. There are tiny mistakes on quite a few of them, but it would depend on how much you scrutinise them looking at them. That's why they take a long time. I mean, on average, it's 500 in total, and it's between 2 and 3 a day on average that get finished. So yeah, I was asked at some point in Gracious Street from one of the actual live audiences how many I get done a day, and before I could say anything, they guessed like 50, 100. Oh God, no. They look completely, well, in my opinion, rubbish and not related to the idea of what it is to be as perfect as possible.
When you choose the next pair of shoes, is there anything in that decision, or is it just you just pick? Is there something symbolic in the next pair?
Oh, I'm going to give myself away as being human here. I choose what I fancy. Which I think it would be interesting, especially being quite intense in the last couple of weeks here. I was thinking it would be really interesting to have a randomised process, so that I'm handed a pair by some kind of binary code or something like that. What's the next one that I'm doing? Because yes, it is very human what I do. It is literally, I have done a very complicated pair. I'd like to do a simple one. I've done a few male ones. I'd like to do a pair of heels. And I think that's quite a weakness of the piece, that there should be more.
Hold on.
I mean, personally, I wouldn't describe it as a weakness. It's interesting that it's perception, isn't it? Because what you perceive as being the next pair is also aligned with what people are seeing, and it's their perception, their reaction to what you're doing. And someone mentioned about a multi-layered perception. People see. Some people have associated your work with the Holocaust, some people associate it with, there might be some people who are looking at it and thinking, seeing you using a wheelchair and painting, and this idea of the kind of futile, never-ending tasks that were often given to, say, blind people, weaving baskets, just hiding the baskets away, just giving them something to do. And there's often, I'm using this pejoratively, but there's this idea that people refer to as all art is nonsense. I like the way you refer to the absurdity of the work that you've done, that element to it. And I think that when children see you, and I think of myself as a child, when I used to take a lovely toy and just paint it, I do remember painting a few things and ruining it. Absolutely ruining this expensive toy.
But did you? Or did you just
I
change
didn't
it?
feel like it ruined it, and I think that's why you got the engagement from the children. They weren't saying, well, you've ruined a pair of shoes, whereas an adult or someone thinking about it from a financial or materialistic perspective, from a child, I think you've enhanced it, you've either made it your own, and I think there's, I don't know if anyone else remembers as children, I used to quite like painting things, and even though I was told I did, I made it my own. And I do love the way that you kind of handed over the understanding of your work and the perception of your work to other people. It's kind of it's giving a lot, considering how much you put into it and how much effort is required on your part to actually hand over that perception, that understanding, and just saying, well, you understand it, you perceive it, and you react to it. I just find that part
But I think I do that in quite a lot of my work. That I'm very precious over the concept when I come up with it, and then when I actually do it, or in the times when my work was more installation and performance based, when it's out there, it almost becomes somebody else's property, and somebody else's right to interpret. And that doesn't necessarily need to be mine, and I think that's fine to have different interpretations.
Does anybody else have any more questions, or shall we perhaps move towards having another drink and we can all talk together in a different way? I just would very much like to thank Noëmi
Well,
for
thank
this
you very much, Nikki.
wonderful piece,
Yeah.
and it's been a delight to be able to talk to you about it.
I'll just say a big thank you to Noëmi and Nikki as well, and also to Lucy and Jonathan for all of your hard work over these past 2
thank
weeks,
you.
and Camden for their support.
Thank you for having me.